Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Father Michael Calabria, and I am a chaplain in residence here at Georgetown. I'm also a Franciscan friar. That is a religious order within the Catholic Church. As the Jesuits are an order within the Catholic Church, so are the Franciscans. And I'm happy to be with you tonight to be talking about reform and renewal in the Catholic Church. It's an unusual topic for me to be speaking about because usually when I speak publicly, I speak about Islam. And I probably am more comfortable with talking about reform in the 19th century in Egypt with Muhammad Abdul and Rifat Tahtawi and Al-Afghani and people like this. But this was a good experience for me to reflect on my own tradition from the perspective of reform. To begin with, I must say something of an apologia. That is, I am not a church historian, and I am not a historian of the Second Vatican Council, which I will be talking about. But when I studied theology, I was very much instructed in the theology of the Church that was expressed at the Second Vatican Council. And the only church I know is the Church of the Second Vatican Council, that is from the early 1960s on. I was born in 1961. I was born in 1961. The Second Vatican Council begins in 1963, and so it's the only church I know. So I am formed in a church that has as its perspective reform. Although, as we will talk about, not everyone got on board. So, if you have questions of clarity, please ask them as I'm speaking. If you have bigger questions, please hold those for later because I only have a half an hour according to the Imam. And he is the boss. So, to begin with, in order to understand reform in the Catholic Church, we have to understand something about the organization of the Catholic Church, which, as you see, is very hierarchical. Now, I must stress it was not always as hierarchical as it is now. And when I talk to a lot of younger people and they say, well, it's always been this way. No, it has not always been this way, and therefore it does not have to remain this way. It's something, this is not cast in stone. This is reflective of human culture. It does not come from the mind of God necessarily. Whether it is or not is still an open question. Okay, but you see, it's very, very hierarchical with the Pope at the top, with the College of Cardinals who will select the new Pope, archbishops, bishops, priests, and everyone else called the laity. Now, in this structure, or outside of this structure, are people like me. Because I'm part of a religious order, Franciscan. The Jesuits are also kind of outside of this order, although men's religious orders do include priests. So I kind of fit in this order, but not really. Because men's religious orders have their own hierarchies. We do kind of fit under the authority of a bishop as long as we are serving in the jurisdiction of a bishop. So if I'm serving in a church, and all churches are under the authority of a bishop, then I report to him. But ordinarily, my reporting goes within my own religious order rather than this way. And I like it that way. If you are a religious sister, you are also outside of this structure, and your standing in the church is probably here, along with everyone else. Now, the Catholic Church, has to be said, as you probably are well aware, is a very conservative organization. If you just talk about it as an organization, change does not happen easily or quickly. It happens very slowly, and we're talking over hundreds of years rather than from year to year or even decade to decade. However, built into the church is the mechanism for reform. And that mechanism are what we call ecumenical councils. That is, when the representatives of the church come together. Now, historically, if we talk about the first ecumenical council, which was in the year 325, that was the first council of Nicaea up until Vatican II. For most of the church's history, those councils were called not for purposes of reform, let alone renewal, which often has a very negative connotation to some people. Most of those councils were used to solve some theological dispute, or to clarify theology, or to settle some other issue that was going on, address some kind of crisis. It is only really with the Second Vatican Council, 1962-65, that you can actually say that the council was used in order to bring about reform and renewal in the church. So it's very new, it's a new idea to use the ecumenical council in this way. Now, I'm going to be speaking primarily about the Second Vatican Council because we could spend, a whole year on reform in the church, or lack thereof. The Second Vatican Council was the brainstorm of Pope John XXIII, who becomes Pope in 1958. Now he is, correct me if I'm wrong, 77 years of age when he becomes Pope, so he's an elderly man. And most people figured that he was only going to be Pope for a couple of years, and he would die, and then they would move on, and without any major events. So people were very surprised when he calls for a council which has the express purpose of reform. Why is John XXIII so different from a lot of his predecessors and even some of his successors? A lot of this has to do with his own personal biography. He was a priest when World War I broke out, and he served in the Italian army as a medical officer. He carried the stretchers when people were injured, and he served as chaplain. He saw the horrors of war firsthand, and I think that experience sets him apart from a lot of men who have served as pope. Also important, he served as the papal nuncio, that is, the church's ambassador to Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. Why is this important? Well, clearly, Bulgaria, not a Roman Catholic country, primarily Orthodox. So he's already having to deal with the Catholic Church as a minority within an Orthodox majority, kind of the things that we were talking about with Imam a couple of minutes ago. He served in Turkey as the papal ambassador, predominantly Muslim country, and in Greece, again Orthodox. So in other words, he's learning in his professional career how to engage with other faith communities when he is representative of a minority community. That's important. Now, World War II, very interesting. He is sent to serve as the papal nuncio in France, occupied France. And what does the church ask him to do? The church asks him to retire those priests who had collaborated with the Germans. So there he is kind of working in a deliberate area of justice. And he was very instrumental in saving many Jews, men, women, and children. Because of his diplomatic work, he knew how to work diplomatic channels to move Jews out of Europe into Turkey to the Holy Land in order to preserve them. So he has a very, very keen awareness of religious persecution He understands the horrors of war. And those things are really crucial to understanding his mind when he calls for the Second Vatican Council. He is also, of course, if you look at his years, keenly aware after World War II that now we're in this very dangerous age called the Cold War, with the threat of nuclear weapons. These are the things that are moving him. These are the things that are telling him that the church must move into the modern world in order to deal with the horrors of the modern world. War, human suffering. And so he issues an encyclical, Humanae Salutis, in 1961, calling for a council. Why? A council, he said, that would give the church the possibility to contribute more efficaciously to the solution of the problems of the modern age. In other words, it is incumbent upon the church to help solve the difficulties that the modern world is experiencing. Now, in his opening address to the council, he dies actually right after the first session of the council. So he doesn't live to see the council come to fruition. But he speaks at the opening council, at the opening session. And he says, the Catholic Church raising the torch of religious truth by means of this ecumenical council desires to show herself to be the loving mother of all, benign, patient, full of mercy and goodness towards the brethren who are separated from her. These are words that every Catholic man, woman, priest, and lay would be well to keep in mind. Because, if truth be told, the church has not always acted benignly, patient, and full of mercy and goodness. And we need to keep this in mind when we talk about real reform. Now, I'm going to try to put this as simply as possible because, again, we could spend a semester, if not a year, talking about what happens at the Second Vatican Council. Basically, it was a shift in the theology of the church. How the church viewed itself vis-a-vis the world, how the church viewed the laity vis-a-vis the priesthood in particular. So if we think about the church up until the Second Vatican Council, it was a very black and white, had a very black and white view of the world. That is, there was the sacred and the secular. Different. There is the church and the world. Separate. And there is the priesthood and the laity. Separate. Black and white. East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. Okay? It was not a church engaged in the world. It was a church that set itself in opposition to the world. We're not like you. We're not concerned with the things that you're concerned about. We'll do our thing. You do your thing. The priesthood and the laity, I'm a different person than you are, was the view of a priest. I'm not like you. I have been ordained. I have been ontologically changed because I'm a priest. That makes me different from who you are as a lay person. This is going to change with Vatican II in a major way. Or at least Vatican II is going to advocate the changes. I'm sorry? We'll get there. We'll get there. Now, what Vatican II does, or aspires to do, is to remove that dividing line, that distinction between the secular and the sacred. It's a false dichotomy in the view of the Council because everything that is created by God bears sacredness. This sacred and secular is a false way of looking at the world. It's not just a church that is holy ground. All ground is holy because God has created it. Okay, there are dedicated spaces for the worship of God, yes. But is a church any holier than where a family is raised? Where a family cares for one another and loves one another? Where a community takes care of one another? These are the kinds of things that Vatican II is going to wrestle with. Is the church in opposition to the world, or does it engage the world? Does it speak the language of the world? And what is the relationship between priesthood and laity? Am I really different than you? In my being, because I am a priest, am I different ontologically from you? Or is it simply that we serve in different capacities in the church? Do we have different ministries in the church? These are the questions that Vatican II will pose and say, you know what? We're all in the one body of Christ. We are all in the one creation of God. One existence. That's the Catholic version of Tawhid. Oneness. There is no distinction, really. The distinctions that we make are illusory. Some of the major changes. One of the first documents to come out of the Council, Lumen Gentium. It's an amazing document even today, and I will say that many of the theologies that come out of the Second Vatican Council have not really been fully expressed, have not come to their fulfillment yet. Lumen Gentium addresses the people, the lay people, the faithful. And this is a major shift. And I can't emphasize how very major this is. Prior to the council, the perception was, well, the church really was the purview of the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops and the priests. And we're kind of spectators to all that, the lay people. But we're not really church. We just kind of watch what they do. And we wait for them to kind of bestow the grace of God on us. Lumen Gentium said, the church is the people of God. That's not just the priests. It's not just the Pope. It's not just the bishops. It's everyone. Not just the hierarchy. That is a radical shift in the perception of the church and the laity. Lumen Gentium spoke about a common priesthood. In other words, well, yes, we have those people that are ordained as priests, but the lay people, the average person, also is called to a common priesthood. And so the document said, though they differ from one another in essence and not only in degree, the common priesthood of the faithful and the ministerial of hierarchical priesthood, that is the ordained priests, are nonetheless interrelated. Each of them is in its own special way, is a participation in the one priesthood of Christ. Whoa. Wait a minute. Father, you're saying that I, as a layperson in the pew, participate in the priesthood of Christ? Yes, my sisters and brothers. Now, the ordained priest has a special function in that community of believers, but the common person also, by their activity in the church, participates in the priesthood of Christ. Now, what you see, I think you may be able to feel it already, I hope, is that that slope of hierarchy is starting to flatten out a bit. That was the endeavor of the council. Lumen Gentium also said, the holy people of God shares also in Christ's prophetic office. Whoa. You see, prior to the council, everyone was very comfortable thinking about, okay, the priest is like the representative of Christ to the people. And the Vatican Council says that all the faithful reflect the common priesthood and the prophetic office of Christ. All of us can be prophetic, are called to be prophetic as Christ was, not just the priest. Now, you can see where this could cause some people to be uncomfortable. Because if the faithful, if the average man and woman participate in the prophetic office of Christ, does that mean that they can challenge what the priest says? Can they challenge what the bishops say? Can they challenge what the Pope says? Yes, because they share in the common priesthood and the prophetic office of Christ. That's the implication. In other words, just because you're a bishop, it doesn't mean you're right. And just because you're a layperson doesn't mean you are simply irrelevant. Prior to the council, the great emphasis in the church's sacramental life would be that of ordination, the process by which a man becomes a priest. That is where the emphasis is, because you see, he's going to represent Christ to the faithful. So this very act of ordination is the pinnacle of the sacramental life of the church. The Second Vatican Council changes this and says, you know what the most important sacramental act of the church is? Baptism. That is, all of the baptized share equally in the church. We have different functions within the church. The Pope has his job, the bishops have their job, the priests have their job, and the laity have their job. But we are all baptized. That means we're all in the same boat. It means there is no intrinsic difference among us because we have been baptized into the one church. That's my sleeve, by the way. This is my great niece. Now, this pertains to religious orders as well. Now, if you are a member of a religious order like I am, you take what is called solemn vows. The way married people take vows to one another, I take a vow to my religious order. Because of what happened at the Vatican Council, even though I was ordained a priest, my ordination to priesthood was not as, if you will, big event as when I took my solemn vows. My solemn vows, as a Franciscan, define who I am. My priesthood is a ministry that I exercise on behalf of God and God's people. But my identity, if you will, comes from the vows that I take as a Franciscan. So you see what's happened here. It's a different idea of priesthood. The priesthood is a ministry within the church, but it doesn't make you more important than anyone else in the church. It just means you have a different job. But everyone else in the church has a job as well. A universal call to holiness. It's not only priests that are called to be holy, or the Pope. Everyone, no matter what your walk of life is, whether you are single or married, whether you are religious or a layperson, or a priest or a religious sister, everyone is called to holiness. There is no better in the church. You are not better because you are a member of a religious order. You're not better because you're a single person. A married person, if you live your marriage faithfully, you are as good as a religious who lives their vows faithfully. Now, this is where things really take off. Because if you have this understanding that all people are called to holiness, that there really is no intrinsic difference between the different participants in the life of the church, then, by extension, all people are called, all people, not just Christians, are called to universal holiness. And therefore, if you are holy, no matter what your religious affiliation is, then you will be saved. My God, people said, you mean to tell me that those Protestants can be saved too? And those Jews can be saved? And those Hindus? And those Muslims? And those Buddhists? And the Vatican Council says yes. Yeah. Look what it says. Talk about reversal. The plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator. In the first place, I want you to remember, are the Muslims, who professing to hold the faith of Abraham along with us adore the one and merciful God who on the last day will judge humanity. Among the first. Can you imagine? Now remember the history. You know the history. You know the animosity between the church and the Muslim world. And in the stroke of a pen, if you will, the church says, you know what? We've been wrong. We've been wrong. Because we have condemned a lot of people saying you're going to hell if you don't believe in us. And the church says, wait a minute. God offers salvation to all. And you don't have to be Catholic in order to be saved. Those also can attain to salvation who through no fault of their own do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, yet sincerely seek God and moved by grace strive by their deeds to do his will, and it is known through them through the dictates of conscience. If you are a person of faith, whether you are Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Jewish, whatever it is, if you live your faith conscientiously, faithfully, the church says, God will save you through your tradition. Nostra Aetate, coming back to another document, a document that I will have to let you know was influenced by the teachings of St. Francis. The church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. Sorry, ladies, that was the language at the time. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even his inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, see, this is where we get this Abrahamic faiths talk, begins with Second Vatican Council, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself submitted to God. Notice how the church at the Second Vatican Council privileges Islam. It's remarkable. Now, it has to be said that as the church changed its way of dealing with Islam, of viewing Islam, it also drastically changed the way it viewed Jews and Judaism. Because up until the Second Vatican Council, in the liturgy of the church, we still talked about the quote-unquote perfidious Jews, the evil Jews. That was part of our language. John the 23rd, even before the Second Council, eliminated that because of his experience of the Holocaust, because of his experience with Jews. So now we had a rapprochement with Judaism as well. You really see the concepts of this interreligious dialogue, particularly with John Paul II, who was very, very active with meeting with representatives from the Muslim world. And you see what he's doing here? He is actually kissing the Quran. Well, let me tell you, this makes some Catholics crazy. If you go on the internet today and Google, like John Paul II kissing the Quran, you will immediately come to people who thought this was haram khalis. On the day that John Paul II died, I had to preach. And I ended my homily by saying, I will do what John Paul II did. And I took out my Quran and kissed him. Now, very quickly, we see the reforms of the church, particularly in what happened in our worship, how it is that Catholics worshiped. The concept was that worship was not only what the priest was doing, it's what we all did. The Mass was not just the priest's work. We changed the language. Where we prayed in Latin before, now we pray in whatever language was the spoken language. Relevant preaching to address the needs of the world. I want to go back to this and I will quickly end. This is what Vatican II had in mind. This is where those of us who were schooled in Vatican II believe the church needs to continue to move. But there are an awful lot of people who are far more comfortable with this. Because this is black and white. This is very easy. The other way forces you to think. And a lot of people would rather have someone else do the thinking for them. Finally, these are some of the pressing issues that the church still is working on. Things that the Vatican Council could not address specifically. We don't have time to address them specifically here, but there still are challenges, and that big circle is still very much in process. Thank you.
That was great, mashallah.
Ma'am? Take a break now?
No, let's take a break after. I'm open. You will ask the people.
I think we should take a break right now. So let's do that. Yes, because we said that we would take a break at this time. So let's keep it short.
Or Vatican II, it could take a full semester. One would say the same thing about reform within the Muslim community and Islamic reform. One could take a semester or actually a year. Few things I want to speak about as I present my PowerPoint presentation. We'll have enough time, I hope, for questions and answers. Number one of my favorite American movies is Sister Act. Who did not watch that movie? Who didn't? You need to watch it. It's a beautiful movie, and it comes to my mind very, very, very often. Though it is a story about an American experience of religious reform, but it can be applicable in the Muslim community, in the Jewish community, in the Christian community, in the political community, about every kind of community in terms of how people feel comfortable with the status quo, and people feel that the only thing out there is the status quo, what has been, and are so afraid or worried about moving forward, or even sometimes asking the question even behind the door about what is happening. And lack of courage is what we are facing when it comes to reform or lack of reform. And so someone comes out sometimes of the blue, sometimes from whatever circumstances, and says, wait a minute, we really need to think it twice. We need to not take this for granted. We need to ask the tough question as to what went wrong, what went right, and how we can move forward. So it's an amazing movie. It makes you laugh a lot, but it makes you think a lot as well. That's number one. Number 2 point is, when we talk about tajdeed or reform in Islam, we are talking about what I call back to the future. It is an attempt to rediscover what has been lost in order to move forward, believing that within the Muslim experience, that is historically within Islam, there have been so many rights lost in the modern world, so many open, inclusive ideas that has become so foreign to Islam and to Muslims that one can discover and find within Islam historically. So I write there, Islamic orthodoxy vis-a-vis Muslim reform and tajdeed. Tajdeed is the Arabic word for reform, sometimes translated as renewal, from the word jadid, to renew, or to bring something, or make something new, or rediscover something and bring it to the forefront. And so when we talk about these ideas, whether reform in prayer, reform in ethical values, reform, are we really bringing out something new? Or is this something that was in existence, was in practice, and was lost? I think I mentioned this here before, a book written by Muhammad al-Ghazali, the current Muhammad al-Ghazali, who died about 13 years ago. In one of his books, he had a chapter called Safahatun min al-Tarikh Matwiya, Forgotten Pages of History. I mentioned this so many times here, and I will continue to do so, because I think that is what we are up to. We are up to, within the case of Islam, we are up to discovering pages that have been forgotten, writings that have been ignored, ethical values that have been in-depth discussed 1,000 years ago, to discover in the 21st century that these values actually existed and people wrote about them 1,000 years ago. So what went wrong? So are we up to reform by means of introducing something new? Or are we up to discovering orthodoxy with a new garment? So what is it exactly that we are talking about? I dare to say that Islamic reform is an attempt to rediscover orthodoxy, an orthodoxy that will be quite amazing to discover in the case of Islam. And that our war now within the Muslim community, worldwide, within the Ummah, worldwide, is a war between an embracing, open, inclusive, universal orthodoxy, okay, or an extremist, alienating, exclusivist, Marxist extremism. I think that's what we're up to. Whether that's right or wrong, that's what my presentation is going to talk about. So I talk about here between historical past and present challenges. There are present challenges that are facing the Ummah, the world community of Islam. And those challenges are to be taken seriously and addressed seriously with no fear in order to move forward. The last thing I would say about the concept of tajdeed, this is not a new term that was created in the 21st century or even 20th century. Actually, there is a hadith. There is a hadith, an authentic hadith, where Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, said that at the head of every 100 years, there will be a mujaddid, that someone will emerge within the Muslim community, within the Ummah, who will yujaddidu lil-ummati amra diniha, who will help the Ummah, the international Muslim community, renew their understanding of Islam, renew their understanding of the tradition, and understand the tradition in relation to current relevant issues in ways that may not have existed in earlier years. So if one thinks seriously about this hadith, for me, Prophet Muhammad, from the very first days of Islam, is challenging Muslims to always be up for reform, up for tajdeed, up for rethinking, up for do not accept the status quo. Ask the question. Ask the question. Have you lost something? Have you lost some point, some value that you need to rediscover? Have you lost your moral compass, your ethical, your theological compass? Do you need to be shaken? Do you need to move forward? Yes, I do. How? So the challenge of Muhammad, upon him be peace, from day one for Muslims is to always be up on their toes and not take this reform as an anti-Islam, but rather as an authentic, natural growth within Islam. Quite interesting. And there have been tons of writings historically about Muslim scholars who have historically tried to make this hadith, take it literally. So, okay, let us study Islam after 100 years. Who emerged after 100 years? What about after 200 years, 300 years, 400 years? And there are books that discuss Muslim scholars and how every 100 years there have been a generation of scholars who stood up and said, wait a minute, we need to ask a question here. We need to shake up a few dusts here. You know, we need to move forward. So this is up real, authentic orthodoxy as we talk about reform. What is the crisis that we're up to when we talk about reform, when we talk about tajdeed? We are talking about those wandering or lost between secularism and extremism. This is what the Ummah, what the world Muslim community is up to. There is an image of Islam that has driven people to the far right or to the far left in the Muslim community, and we lost that middle way. Though in chapter 2, verse 143, the Quran talks about how وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا, that God wanted you Muslims to be of the middle way. God did not want you to be to the far right or to the far left. So what happened historically with us, especially in the last 100 years, we have been lost between extremism to the far right, away from orthodoxy, away from reform, away from the paradigm that I will discuss in a slide or two, or to the far left. That image that has been enforced on us turned us off. So there are people who say, well, I'm not interested in Islam. Why? Because of 1, 2, 3. So the question is that really Islam you are not interested in? Or is it a new paradigms and new shifts and new teachings that are not really Islamic that you're not interested in? So are you running away from Islam, or are you running away from what has become Islam, which is the challenge of of reform and tajdeed in Islam? Again, shake that dust off and say what happened and how we can move forward. The crisis that we are up to is actually bloodshed and loss of life. When we talk about tajdeed and reform, it is a serious matter, because in the name of Islam, people are being killed. We need to be honest about it. In the name of Islam. In the name of Islam, bombs are going off. In the name of Islam, people are being called kafir, infidel, un-Muslim, declared easy to kill and go after. So we are talking about real blood, real lives that are endangered in the name of Islam. We're up to misinterpretation and misunderstanding. Misinterpretation of the text, misinterpretation of orthodoxy, but also misunderstanding of that Islam and what it is really meant to do and what it is really about. It's that misinterpretation and misunderstanding that requires much serious real work of reform, real work of tajdeed. The new world order, the world in the 21st century, is not what it was 100 years ago. It is not. We no longer live in exclusive areas. We can no longer claim that this is a Christian nation or a Muslim nation. We can no longer can exclude ourselves from the rest of the world. We're a very connected world, whether we like it or not. We're connected via internet. Now with virus, if you, my God, if you internet, your life could be destroyed overnight. So a very well-connected world that require a new thinking in the name of Islam that will help us to protect what we should be protecting. The big bomb, whether that bomb is an actual bomb that can be used to sacrifice lives and lands, or the big bomb of the brain that has lost its connection with God. The de-spiritualizing of man is the worst bomb that we are up to. And I think Islam can help, can be a partner with other religions, if not alone, in spiritualizing or helping the human being rediscover its the most valuable it has, the spirit, the soul, and its relationship with God. The crisis is, I believe, as the Quran says, by the way, the Quran declares that if you do not stand up for what is right, God will replace you with a nation that will be able to do that. You know, that every nation, according to the Quran, has to stand up for what is right and speak against what is wrong and promote justice. And the Quran says in that very verse, if you don't do that, God will replace you with people who can do that. So Muslims, God is telling them in the Quran that if you don't stand up for those values that you are supposed to stand up for, God will take you away. So is it an existential issue? So what is it that God wants us to stand up for before we are replaced? For the sake of humanity, we will be replaced. So it's Islam's paradigms that have governed Muslim mujaddideen or reformers who have existed in Islam and have appeared and have written about Islamic reform. That one very important concept is the concept of Tawheed. Number one, number two, and number 100 issue of Islam is maintaining the oneness of God. That when we talk about God in terms of, or for the purpose of maintaining God's oneness, to make sure that God continues to be the center of the universe, the center of our minds, the center of our focus. But to be muwahhid, to maintain God's oneness according to that paradigm, to that dimension in Islam, Muslims are required to do three things. Number one, be spiritually uplifted. So as Muslims, when we write about Islam, when we understand Islam, we have to understand it as a faith, as a tradition that is meant to spiritually uplift us. And if Islam is no longer spiritually uplifting us, there's no wrong with Islam, but rather with our understanding of Islam. So if Islam lost that dimension of spirituality, we are losing Islam itself. So we have to bring that spirituality back to the forefront. Number two, being morally excellent, moral excellence in the human being and the way the human being behaves. And number three, being physically sound. The Quran declares, Hadith declares, Islamic jurisprudence declares that Muslims are expected by their tradition to maintain the earth. We are meant to represent God on earth. Our main number one goal as Muslims is to protect the earth from a possible destruction. And it is that action that will help us become physically sound, healthy, in the way we live materialistically on earth. Back to moral excellence. That moral excellence is built according to Ibn Qayyim on two foundations, justice and rahmah, justice and compassion. And therefore, one cannot declare oneself to be abiding by the teachings of Islam or the teachings of Tawheed if one does not have these two qualities. In the way we write, in the way we operate, and in the way we behave. Justice and compassion are to govern Islamic moral behavior. And if it fails to honor justice and compassion, it cannot maintain the oneness of God. So when we see Muslim writers, or Muslim preachers, or Muslim writings, or whatever it is, CDs, DVDs, that fail to contribute their work to justice, or be interested in compassion, we have to publicly declare them un-Islamic, because they don't share justice and compassion. Justice and compassion are expected to meet 3 criteria that I have spoken about so many times, and I know I repeat myself sometimes, because these are the foundations. These are the foundations. Politics of justice, economics of equity, and covenant of community. This is what Islam is, I believe. So when we speak about reform, reform for the sake of returning to that paradigm, maintaining the oneness of God by becoming a voice for justice and compassion, a voice for the earth, and spiritual upliftment. In order to maintain this concept of justice and compassion, when we talk about politics of justice, covenant of community, and economics of equity, we are talking about a society that is built on individuals. The society is important within that paradigm. The individual is as important. So we talk about the community, we talk about the individual. The relationship between the individuals and between the individual and the society is supposed to be built on justice. And that justice is built on 3 foundations. Not one kind of justice, whether distributive justice or contributive justice or contractual justice. The justice we are talking about is social justice. This is Islam. This is what is expected of Muslims by the teachings of the Quran in order to be called Muslims. So when we talk about reform, when we talk about tajdeed, it's an attempt to bring Muslims back to focus on their relationship with God by honoring the relationships between the individuals and the society, a relationship that is built on justice, on adala, and on adl in every way, shape, and form. Many Muslims do not understand what is at stake. You might feel from my language how seriously I'm taking this subject. It is not their wealth or their numbers only that is at stake. What is at stake is their very faith and their very way of life, the very way they are called upon to live that social justice. To be Muslims, they have to be socially committed to the common good of all God's creation. That's the challenge of Islam. And that's the challenge and the main material, the main focus of Islamic tajdeedi writings. All those who have written on tajdeed, whether Shaykh Waliullah or even Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, believe it or not, or Muhammad al-Ghazali or Malik bin Nabi, this was their focus. What are those orthodox teachings that we need to bring back, we need to rediscover? I spoke about some of those, so we don't have the time to move into every one of these slides for the sake of time, because I really want to engage you in the discussion. Sharia in relation to other than Muslims. So when Muslims talk about reform, Muslims have to keep in mind these very specific values. The numbers you see on the right are the quote from the Quran. Universal brotherhood, no forced conversion to Islam or any religion, peaceful coexistence, acceptance of pluralism, especially place for the Jews and the Christians, and interfaith dialogue. This is the main focus of Sharia according to Islam. This is the main focus of Islam. Helping Muslims rediscover a God who is a God of love, mercy, and justice. So our focus should be not on a God that destroys, but rather on a God that loves, on a God that shows mercy, on a God that shows compassion and forgiveness and goodness. God's revelation is not exclusively about humanity. Another paradigm that has been taken seriously by Muslim reformers. Islam is not, main interest is not only humanity. It is also about the earth and its protection. It's about ants and bees. It's about jinn and angels. How we eat, how we live, how we die in harmony with our surroundings. And therefore Islamic writings must contribute to a world that is at peace with itself, not only to a humanity that is at peace with itself. The law of existence also is a part of that paradigm, made from the soil and born of the earth, we human beings, searching for the green things on earth and in heavens, the oceans flowing through our veins, restoring the balance, mizan and qistas al-mustaqim in the Quran. So many verses in the Quran that sort of forces Muslims to think about maintaining the balance within this creation, within this earth. The balance between man and the balance between man and the rest of the creation, but balance within the creation. The law of divine love for all. Within that tradition of orthodoxy, there existed important role for education. The first verse that was ever revealed in the Quran said, Iqra, read, 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 and read, and read again. It says, Iqra bismi, which means read in the name of God, in between the lines of all things. You don't read, but rather you read in between the lines. That is to say, the Quran from day one, from the first verse of its revelation, focuses on the need to read, to think, and to reflect. And therefore, by doing so, Islam wanted us to establish a healthy relationship between reason and revelation. So when we as Muslims fail to honor that healthy relationship between reason and revelation, we have gone the wrong direction. So when we fail to honor justice, when we fail to honor compassion, when we fail to honor the earth, when we fail to honor the balance within the earth, we are failing to being Muslim. The better on earth, the better in heavens. Islam's main focus is how we can behave fully Muslims on earth in order to become fully Muslims in the life to come. In order to be in the abode of peace, Darus Salam, in the life to come, we have to live in peace on this earth. So the road to peace, to heavens, goes here is what matters. This is why, if you study the very first 600 years, especially in the history of Islam, you see a lot of focus on education. A lot of focus on understanding, on knowledge. I wish there was time, but there's no time to go through this amazing tradition in the history of Islam. Even Islam focus on philosophy, political science, mathematics, astronomy, algebra, anatomy, you name it. Father Michael took some students and went to the National Geographic exhibition, the 1001 what do you call it? 1001 inventions of Islam. Quite amazing, quite amazing. That what helped that Muslim community maintain its existence was so many things, including their focus on, maybe in the forefront, on knowledge and reason. So one day in history, these hallways were witnessing Jewish, Christian, Muslim debate on God, on politics, on salvation, on history, on Muhammad, on Jesus. For my master's thesis, I translated a booklet was written by Imam in Egypt in the 13th century. And it was a debate between a Christian monk and a Muslim Imam, this Sayuti, at Al-Azhar University. So that debate was there. People did not feel afraid of debating religion, debating anything and everything. Unfortunately, we have now lived in a world of Islam where these debates are no longer happening, actually are suppressed in the name of what? Of Islam. How often do we teach this kind of philosophy at the University of Jordan, at Al-Qura University, at Al-Azhar University, at Qom University? We don't. When I was in Egypt, I begged the scholars of Egypt, the heads of Egypt, to please teach Christianity. Bring Christians to teach Christianity, bring Jews to teach Judaism. Oh, no, we can't do that. Why? Our imams will be at risk. Why? Well, they were not at risk 1,000 years ago. Why should they be at risk now? What is it that has been making you think that you're at risk? So that's what I'm talking about. So I'm about to finish. So when Muslims focus and spend hundreds of millions of dollars to go on the Hajj, however a beautiful and amazing experience it is, amazing experience it is. How can we transform, again, back to my first slide, how can we transform this spiritual uplifting to a reality that gives birth to moral excellence, to being physically sound? How can this very spiritual, amazing experience give birth to a new community that can reinvent science and introduce science to a new reality? So as we invented zero 1,000 years ago, can we invent a new concept in algebra and math that can help the world move forward? Or is Islam going to continue to be this? Unfortunately, it has become just this. Let's be honest. Where early Muslims did not understand Islam to be, if I make my Hajj, I'm going to Jannah, to paradise, but rather, the understanding was, if I transform myself in this experience, with this experience, to become productive citizen in algebra, in mathematics, in astronomy, in science, that is what makes me a Muslim. So for them, this was just the beginning to an everlasting journey. So when we talk about reform and tajdeed, we need to study exactly that. So what went wrong, and we'll conclude with the solutions. Issues we need to look into as we move forward with reform. If it is about our ability to move beyond and depend on and rely on our spiritual connection with God to maintain a universe that can produce the best for our very existence on earth, these are issues that we need to talk about when it comes to reform within the Muslim Ummah. Centralized political powers that deprive people from their political rights. The role of education is no longer at the center. So you take a country like Pakistan, just an example, that spends more than 80% of its budget on military, and 6 or 7% on education, and 2-3% on health. And with that, look into how much Saudi Arabia spends, and Qatar, and Bahrain, and Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the Palestinians, and the Egyptians, and you name it. How much do we spend on education? How do we discuss religious minority rights in Muslim countries? What went wrong after independence from colonialism? Are we to blindly imitate the past or think about the past in order to move forward? Present challenges, poverty, dictatorships, waste of resources, human and financial, the Arab-Israeli conflict, religious extremism, gender equity and equality, or lack thereof, sectarian wars and conflicts. This is the real image of Muslims, and I'm sorry for the pain I may cause some of you, but remember, I am a Muslim, and nothing pains me more than knowing that we can be better. But this is the image. We just need to watch what's happening in Syria, in Somalia, in Afghanistan. What's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Tunisia, what's happening in Bahrain, and move on with the list of countries. Militarism at its worst. Yet, mismanagement of resources. A hotel that cost, as I was told, more than $30 million to build, not far from Bangladesh, not far from Somalia, not far from Eritrea, not far from Africa, not far from Afghanistan, not far from Pakistan, not far from India. Do we really need a hotel of $30 million in a place where there are so many hotels? A hotel that will cost $10 million just to inaugurate. Do we need reform? The very same people who built this mosque overlook the concept of social justice in Islam and go to Hajj every year and they pray 5 times a day and fast the month of Ramadan. Do we need reform in our minds? The way forward. Reducing poverty, to spend more on education, push for real practice of religious freedom, respect of minorities, manage our resources well, the rule of law, true sense of democracy and respect for it, end of extremism, gender equity, freedom of press. For Muslims, this all means that the Ummah must keep God alive in society, and the God of love, compassion, justice, and peace, or the Ummah will no longer exist. The Ummah must speak the truth and make it clear, knowing that the truth shall set you free and liberated. Only the truth. The Ummah must continue to lift higher the banner of peace, even against self-interest. That requires a lot of reform. The Ummah must keep in mind that justice and peace teachings must be deep-rooted in prayer and worship and in our literature. The values of the Ummah's justice and peace teachings must not be treated as optional. They are not as optional. They must be a core part of teachings and formations. Muslims must be offered opportunities to work for change in the policies and structures that cause injustice along their fellow human beings. Muslims must reform or die, sorry to say that, or disappear, because they will. If you don't become a voice for justice, God will replace you with people who can become a voice for justice. So if you care about your own self, you have to become a voice for justice, a voice for compassion, as I just showed from the teachings of Islam. Speak against all atrocities committed in the name of Islam. Muslims must reclaim their faith from the extremists. It is about time and no other time but this time. Muslims must use the wealth they have for the uplifting of the poor and the deliverance of the captives. For all of us, this means to walk the walk together for a world that is at peace with itself and at peace with its Creator. Islam contends that peace, the establishment of conditions of just relationships and non-exploitative social structures are more conducive to the attainment of sustainable peace and upholding the principle of non-violence. My friends, sisters, and my brothers, sorry to say my Muslim sisters and brothers, I'm not here to make you feel bad about Islam. I love Islam. I love Islam to my core, to my bone, to my back, to my heart, to my soul. For me, that is Islam. But what went wrong? Do we need reform? Do we need tajdeed? Not to bring out new teachings, but teachings that existed, that changed, that made a difference. And can that be your work, and my work, and our work? Thank you. And Michael, you want to come up here?
My shoes.
I can take off my shoes. It's okay.
I forgot my shoes. I'm happier without my shoes.
Okay. Questions?
So, it's sort of, in a way, it's only right that the two of the main Abrahamic religions are both in trouble. Judaism doesn't appear to be. Their numbers are small, and they're not going anywhere. The numbers, Christianity's numbers are diminishing as fast as Islam's are increasing. So it is interesting that the numbers are there and they're saying something. But there's also a great increase, especially in Europe, in secularism. So why hasn't there been an equal increase in the East in secularism? And I think the answer is the Enlightenment and the short life of the Islamic Enlightenment in Baghdad in the 800s. So has that got something to do with what we're experiencing today?
It's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to talk about the Christian world monolithically, as it's impossible to talk about the Islamic world monolithically. When I go to Egypt and visit with my Christian friends there, I'm amazed because Christianity is not something that they do. It's something that they live, in the way my Muslim friends in Egypt live it. I think in the West, perhaps because we live in a secular culture, religion tends to be something that you do. And you do it, if you're Christian, maybe once a week. You go to Mass, and that's it. You do it. But I think in much of the what we call the developing world, religion is not an activity. It's the fabric of your life. It's the matrix on which everything else hangs. Why that happened, you could say it's Enlightenment. I think there are probably many elements to that. But it's not, I mean, although we clearly see a decline in Christianity in Western Europe, In the developing world, Christianity is still very much alive. I mean, people are talking about, will the next pope be a Latino? Will he be an African? There are more Franciscan vocations, I think, in India now than there are in the United States. So the question is, why is that happening? I think it has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do with the history of religions in those parts of the world. But it's not an easy question to answer, I would say.
I want to reflect on your sentence, which is the short-lived enlightenment in Baghdad. I never will claim that Muslims were perfect for 1400 years. They were never perfect, no one. But I dare to say that Muslims went through ups and downs for 1400 years. The last 150, 100, 200 years maybe have been the worst in our history. But if you take Spain, there's a lot that one can look at with pride. If you talk about Egypt and the Fatimites of Egypt and what they were able to do, Baghdad, you want to go with me to Uzbekistan, you know, a place I wish every Muslim and non-Muslims could go to is Bukhara or Tashkent or Samarkand in Uzbekistan. My God, my God, my God. You will feel history coming to life, where people were there talking, learning science, where Jews and Muslims lived side by side in every way, shape, and form. A book came out a few years ago, how Judaism and Islam influenced each other culturally and in terms of civilizations. Look at the currency that existed, where Muslims had the Star of David at their currency. From the very first 2 centuries of Islam, Muslims were not offended by the cross, by the Star of David. They were not. Actually, in that book you find the cross also. If you go to Turkey, I found in Turkey some mosques with the Star of David inside the mosque. Yes, it's not a problem. So what went wrong that now we feel, my God, the Star of David is my enemy? What went wrong? Why was Christianity debated in the mosque at the Azhar University, and that was not seen as an offense, but now it is seen as an offense? So we went through ups and downs, but that's what Tajdeed and reform is all about. Can we rely on the positive sides of our civilizations and interactions, learn from the bad and move forward? This is why from the beginning of my presentation I said back to the future. In a way, that's the Quranic charge to Muslims. إِنَّ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ لَعِبْرَةً لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. That in their stories, in the Quranic stories, there is a lesson for those who can reflect. So can we learn from the failures of Muslims? Yes, the failure of Muslims, or the failure of Christians, and the failure of Jews to move forward. So this is why I want to depend on and rely on the positive, enlarge it, you know, magnify it, learn from the negative as we move forward in the 21st century. At the end of the day, I say what happened, whether failure or success. We are, me and you, and we have discussed this before, we're in the 21st century, where 13,000 women are sold to slavery every month in the world. That's our charge. That's the charge of the Catholic Church. So when we talk about reform within the Catholic Church, or even within the American evangelical community, where at one point the focus of the American evangelical community was on abortion and abortion and abortion. Now you see American evangelical ministers talking about environmental issues, talking about trafficking issues, talking about issues that really matter to everyone around us. We just had a conference at Georgetown University sponsored by evangelical Christians on trafficking. This was not a part of the agenda maybe 30 or 40 years ago. The same thing with Muslims. So these are books I'm carrying. This is written by Jamal al-Banna, who just died a few weeks ago, called Nahwa Fiqh Jadid, towards a new understanding of jurisprudence. Quite an amazing book, where he says, can we be the children of today and tomorrow, focusing on what matters to us now, learning from the past, but focus on what really matters. Even if we have to reconstruct our understanding of religion.
Having lived for many years in a Muslim majority country, I wonder why I didn't see a lot of social justice for the local inhabitants, if social justice is a cornerstone of Islam.
That's exactly what I said, by the way. What I said is that that's exactly why I'm angry, why I'm frustrated, why I'm sweating. To say, as you, my sister, go and live in some Muslim countries, you say, is this Islam? My God, I don't want this kind of religion. And you come back to America advocating that Islam is a terrible religion. I'm not saying that you do that. But if that's your experience, you come back with a terrible experience. You say, well, what's wrong? Very much when Muslims live in Toledo, Ohio, where the mosque was just burned by someone who claimed that Jesus wanted him to do that. So he goes back to Egypt saying, my God, what's going on here? What kind of a Christianity is this? Muslims have, in the last 100 some years, lost focus on the social justice piece of Islam, and Islam became more a set of rituals. So when I stand my sister in America and I say, I do not think that donating money, this is my fatwa, by the way, and I have declared it to be a fatwa, that donating money to build mosques in America is not halal. I said, we need to donate money to build schools that help educate our kids. Because if you only have $1,000, whether you spend it on a mosque for people to go and pray, or you spend it on a child who needs to be educated, I said Islam would require you to pay that money for the poor to be educated, not for the mosque to be built. And this is my understanding of Islam. So when I gave you that image of that hotel, 1 mile from it, they built a mosque. I don't know exactly how many $100 million it cost. It took 10 years to build. Okay? For what? You know how many people pay in that mosque that cost, again, 50, 60, 100, whatever, million dollars? 200 people pray for it Friday. I said, well, that money should be spent in Bangladesh, that is suffering from floods that happen every year, and thousands die because of floods. So I say, we lost Islam. Islam says, the Prophet Muhammad says, جُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا. God made the whole earth for me a place of worship. So you can pray here, you can pray outside, you can pray under a tree. You don't need to have a mosque, you don't need to have a minaret in Islam. You can pray anywhere, but you need to have social justice. You need to take care of the poor, according to Muhammad himself. So have we lost the teachings of Muhammad? A book here, Muhammad al-Ghazali, again, who talks about الانشغال بالجزئيات على حساب الكليات. How we have been over-occupied, focusing on the little bit of things on the expense of what really matters, the big picture. You see where I'm coming from? So yes, there's so many failures in Muslim countries in understanding the Islam in the way it should, and it was expected. But that's the whole challenge of reform. That's the whole challenge of tajdeed. Why should Muslims either do it, or it will be done for you, and you have to go? However, my last point to you is, I don't want you also to come back to America thinking that's what shapes the Muslim world in every country. There's also a lot of social justice in so many wonderful places. There's so many schools are being built, so many women are being educated.